Again, now I think the question is, does this sort of chain gang or entrap the United States into further strikes? I think it's really clear that Trump doesn't want to do that. But now that he said the site was obliterated and it looked like it wasn't, I mean, he's in a tight spot. I have the feeling he's probably going to get pulled in and we're going to strike them again.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Professor Robert Kelly on the show. We've spoken about this leaked classified report the New York Times has published that said that Donald Trump's attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities didn't exactly destroy them and that it's only been pushed back by a few months. So we speak about that, the fact that Iran is no longer willing to be transparent about their nuclear capabilities. So all that today, and of course, what is happening at the NATO summit? Will these leaders pressure Donald Trump into continuing their support with Ukraine? So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube, or you can stream us as a podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Hi, Maddie. Thanks for having me again.
Well, we've got to start with what happened overnight. The New York Times broke this pretty incredible story. They said that they've seen shared leaked intelligence that indicates that the United States' military strikes did not destroy Iran's nuclear facilities and that the bombings just set back their program by a couple of months. Of course, Donald Trump has denied this, called it fake news. But what is your reaction to this report from the New York Times?
Well, it seems that the information from the Times has been corroborated by some other outlets, including CNN, and has ultimately been traced back to some analytic work that's come out of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So as far as we know, it looks like it's sound. We're still waiting. But I mean, again, if you sort of follow the debate on the internet and so on, it looks like there's sort of an emerging consensus that it didn't work out, that it destroyed some of the target, but not all of it. And I think the bigger concern then is, does that mean that Trump will strike again, right? I think it's pretty clear from the way Trump has talked about conflict in the past that he's very gun shy. He really doesn't want to get into a major conflict while he's president, particularly in the Middle East. I think he's really learned that from George W. Bush. And but if if the bombing didn't work, right? If Israel or Iran can have a nuclear weapon now in 6 months or 9 months or something, it's only been pushed back 3 months or so, which is what seems to be again the emerging consensus. Then that would, suggest that Trump would have to go back in, or the Israelis would have to go back in, right? That it would, in fact, start to slide towards the forever war that I think Trump has been trying hard to avoid.
Yes, we did wonder whether this was mostly just opening a can of worms, getting US involvement. But Bob, was it ever really 100% accurate for the United States to have come out and said that their nuclear facilities had been completely destroyed when we didn't really have a proper assessment on the ground in Iran? We don't have sources within Iran's nuclear team to let us know what had been destroyed.
Yeah, and I think that's very much just a function of Donald Trump's own personality, right? I mean, Trump is sort of prone to impulsive posting on Twitter or Truth Social, right? He kind of shoots his mouth off. He has very poor message discipline, and I think he really wanted to go out there and claim that this was some big thing. I think he had seen all this praise for Israel's strikes on Fox News in the week running up to this, and he kind of wanted to get some of that. He wanted to sort of have the vibe that he sort of looked tough, and he made this sort of like dynamic strategic move that really should change the region, because certainly that was how Netanyahu was talking, and I think a lot of the Fox News hosts that Trump was consuming for the last week, that's how they were talking too, and I think Trump wanted to get in on that, and he got ahead of himself. He got ahead of his skis, if you will. And again, now I think the question is, does this sort of chain gang or entrap the United States into further strikes? I think it's really clear that Trump doesn't want to do that. But now that he said the site was obliterated and it looked like it wasn't, I mean, he's in a tight spot. I have the feeling he's probably going to get pulled in and we're going to strike them again.
What do you think is in Iran's best interest? Do you think it's that they say that their nuclear facilities have been completely destroyed, even if they haven't, or they say they haven't been destroyed and they've still got this card to play? Because it's interesting to see if Iran comes out and says, yes, our nuclear facilities have been completely destroyed, and then what they really do is keep building up their enrichment program in secret.
Yeah, I would imagine that's actually how this thing is going to shake out once the strikes are actually over. To my mind, what you might call the North Korean model of nuclearization, where you kind of sprint come hell or high water for a nuclear weapon and you sort of withstand all the sanctions and the pressure and everything else, and then once you have the nuclear weapon, You can negotiate from that position of strength. I think that has really been validated by what has happened to the Iranians. They negotiated with us in 2015. Trump broke that deal in 2018, and then eventually came the strikes. You know, there's been kind of like a long, winding road from Trump ending that the Iran nuclear deal to this moment. And so, you know, if you're the Iranians, you say, hey, look, the North Koreans, you know, they didn't deal, they didn't get bombed, so maybe we should sort of go their way. I'm very concerned that this is going to validate the North Korean approach, right? That you just sprint for a nuke no matter what, you get the damn thing, and then you can sort of like force everybody to negotiate on your terms. And if I had to guess for the Iranians, that's probably what they're going to do, right? They'll try to get out of this thing in the next couple of weeks, try to end it in some way, and then clandestinely develop it. That's what the North Koreans did, right? I mean, they spent 25 years sort of like with all this smoke and mirrors and games and this and that. Oh, we're not really doing it. Oh, we all want denuclearization. They'd meet South Korean negotiators and American negotiators. It was all this sort of footsie, 2 steps to the right and 3 to the left and whatever. And in the background, they were building and building, and then they finally got it. And my guess is that's where the Iranians are going to go, because if you don't do that, you know, the Israelis might come back in a couple of years.
Yeah, and they've made it clear that they feel like they need a card to play here, Bob, especially because they don't have as strong of a military as Israel and the United States on a united front. But this ceasefire that was brokered by Donald Trump, which was of course violated within a few hours, it didn't include a signed agreement. It didn't include Iran signing off their nuclear facilities and doing this nuclear deal that, of course, we were trying to broker for those 60 days on from Steve Witkoff's position. But so if no further negotiations occur between Iran and the United States, which Donald Trump says no negotiations will occur, then how can the United States be so sure that Iran doesn't plan on building nuclear weapons, especially in the aftermath of this leaked report?
Right, we can't, and that's, I think, the core issue here, right? Is that, again, the United States might get chain ganged into a kind of semi-permanent bombing relationship, for lack of a better word. That's kind of an awkward expression, but a kind of relationship with Iran where they build clandestinely. We get sort of intelligence. The Israelis have pretty good intelligence about what's going on in Iran, apparently, right? And so we get this intelligence maybe 3 or 4 years from now, right? And the Iranians are 3 months away from a bomb, and then we strike them again, right? And then this happened, you know, then they go back and they start to reconstitute, and then 4 or 5 years after that, we have to go back in again. The Israelis even have a term for this kind of relationship. They call it mowing the grass, which is how they approach the Palestinians, particularly Hamas in Gaza, right? So they go in, they hit Gaza, you know, they back away, Gaza reconstitutes, they start making trouble, the Israelis go back in, and they do this every few years. I mean, there's been something like 6 separate Israeli incursions into Gaza in the last 20 years. And I have my concern is that we're going to get into this kind of relationship with Iran, right? We hit them, we push them back a year in the program, they start to reconstitute, then we have to go back in, we are the Israelis, and it becomes this kind of cyclic thing like you see with the Israelis in Lebanon and Gaza. And I don't know if Trump wants that. I don't know if Trump could sell that to Congress. I don't know if the U.S. military thinks this is a good idea, right? I mean, Trump just kind of jumped into this thing, you know, and now we might be stuck in this kind of weird relationship, right? Because Iran doesn't trust us because we violated we broke the deal before, right? And so now the Iranians and us are kind of stuck in this weird back and forth sort of cycle of bombing and reconstitution.
Yeah. It does feel that Donald Trump really doesn't want to escalate anything further. He doesn't want US involvement. He clearly thought this might be like a one bombing attack, and then they jump out of the situation in the Middle East. But yes, if this didn't work to the degree that the US military thought it might, this might escalate the situation further to have US involvement. And I do not see how his constituents would back that.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of I think that's another sort of, we haven't discussed that at all, there are ideological fissures back home, right, which is that a big element of the Trump coalition going back 10 years now has been no wars, right, that the neocons of the old days are sort of responsible for getting the U.S. in these forever wars never go away, and, you know, if you vote for Kamala Harris, you're going to vote for World War III, right, I mean, the Trump people talked like that just a year ago, right? And this really kind of throws that out the window. And again, I'm actually kind of shocked. I actually thought personally, like a week ago, that Trump was not going to do this because I thought the blowback from his domestic coalition would be really, really intense. I'm not actually much of a Fox News consumer myself, so I don't actually know. But it looks like Fox just jumped in on this and went kind of like full neocon, let's sort of hit them. And I wonder where this is going to lead. Because, I mean, if Fox and if the Trump coalition is kind of like flipped and gone neocon, like we're comfortable with U.S. involvement in the Middle East, I mean, then how different is Trump from previous Republicans, right? I mean, the core reason why Trump got elected and beat Bush and so many other candidates back in 2016 was he said Iraq was a mistake, And I just wonder if he kind of like, if he abandons that, I don't know, then MAGA foreign policy is kind of no different than everything else. And then Trump will get his Nobel Prize, which he really wants, right? I mean, this has been, being the peace candidate has been really core to his identity in U.S. politics for a decade. And I'm surprised how rapidly he just kind of dropped that.
Yeah, especially when you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out and saying that we should not get involved, and even Tucker Carlson is having a bit of a fan base moment as of late because he's going up against it, and when he came out not long after the Iraq War and said that was a mistake, he got a lot of kudos from people to say, yeah, step aside from your constituents, from your audience, and to say that was a mistake. The US should not be going into another war. So it's kind of Groundhog Day for the Republicans. But Bob, Reuters is reporting that the National Security Committee of Iran's parliament approved a bill to fully suspend Tehran's cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is, of course, the UN nuclear watchdog. When you look at this headline, does it just show you that this is essentially Iran saying that we're no longer willing to be transparent?
Yeah, and again, I think that's the logical conclusion to draw from this, right? If the Israelis and the Americans feel that they can bomb Iran sort of at will and they can sort of jump out of these agreements after having, signed up for them, then the smart thing to do is kind of what the North Koreans did, which is just sprint for the nuke. And I have the feeling that's probably, if I had to guess, that's probably the debate going on inside Tehran right now, right? In the parliament, around the leader, inside the military, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? That's probably the big discussion now, right? Should we just assume there's no possible deal at all and we should just go? We should just go fast. Because the North Koreans did it. And the North Koreans will probably help. North Koreans love proliferating. They'll sell anything, right? And so, if the North Koreans, if the Iranians want to do this, I mean, there's a whole network out there, right? Sort of like Pakistani scientists and North Koreans and stuff like that who will facilitate this. Again, if you look at the statistics that have been thrown around, I'm not an Iran guy. I'm really sort of a North Korea guy on the nuke stuff. But if you look at the numbers being thrown around in Iran, they're saying that Iran is, 6 to 9 months away from a nuclear weapon. That's less than a year. I mean, that's actually not a very long breakout time, right? I mean, if that's really true, the Israelis could be striking Iran and the Iranians decide to go for it. That could mean the Israelis are striking Iran again by the end of the year, right? I mean, again, that's the slide to forever war, right? If the Iranians are pretty close and they decide to go for it, then we're going to hit them on a fairly regular basis. And again, I just don't know if Trump wants that or if his coalition will sustain it. I think the Israelis are willing to do that. I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of support behind Netanyahu for this kind of campaign, but I don't know if the Americans want that, particularly Trump's sort of a peace candidate kind of coalition, right? Like you're saying, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson and so on.
What's the likelihood, Bob, that Iran has actually sitting and thinking, okay, we should back down. We should just relax. We should follow the rules. We should give in to the United States, give in to Israel, and try and live with a bit of peace and prosperity.
I think there are two problems. The first is that just sort of like nationalist elites in countries almost never say they want to back down, and they get embarrassed before their publics that they do, right? In 1982, when the Argentines lost the Falklands War to the Brits, right, that caused the Argentine junta to fall internally because people were so upset at defeat, right, that they were sort of pushed out, right? And that's the real threat here, right? If you sort of give up and you say we were defeated by the Americans and the Israelis and stuff like that, that kind of undercuts the legitimacy of the regime. I think that's sort of the first core issue, right? The same thing might happen in China. If they attack Taiwan and they lose, the Chinese Communist Party is out. That would be my guess. And the other issue, of course, and again, Iran's specific case, is that Iran is an ideological regime, right? I mean, Iran has a really clear set of beliefs about foreign policy, right, particularly about Israel. And to accommodate, right, we should annihilate Israel, it should be wiped off the map and so on. The Iranians have been saying that since the revolution in 79, and if they back away from that, again, it kind of undercuts the whole sort of raison d'etre of the regime, right? I mean, if it isn't about Islamic ideology and, smashing those Israelis, then, like, what's the point? And so I think it's really unlikely the Iranians would sort of back off and go for normalization.
We saw Donald Trump reacting to Israel and Iran violating the ceasefire. Yesterday, on Tuesday, he actually swore. He was lashing out. He said they don't know what they're doing. So what was your reaction, Bob, to seeing a US president reacting in this way?
Yeah. On the one hand, I think it's kind of understandable, right? I mean, Trump is dealing with two of the most thorny, difficult foreign policy elites in the world out there, right? The governments of Iran and Israel. And certainly Benjamin Netanyahu has driven previous American presidents up the wall. I mean, that is not new, that American presidents find him very, very difficult to deal with, right? And Trump seems to have collided with that. I think on the other hand, it kind of shows that Donald Trump, to be honest, didn't put a great deal of effort into this. I mean, Trump seems to think that he can kind of go on Twitter or Truth Social or whatever and sort of insist that these wars end without actually doing a lot of the legwork, right? I mean, he kind of seemed to think that, like, he could kind of like tell Putin and Russia or Ukraine to stop fighting, and he got sort of annoyed that, one envoy, Witkoff, who didn't know a great deal about these things, kind of didn't pull it off. Same thing on Gaza, right? And I think, the larger lesson to be drawn from this for the president is, if you want to really sort of like have this ceasefire work, you got to get in, you got to do the grunt work, right? You got to like do the subtle diplomacy. You got to do the staff work. You got to get the Secretary of State going over and talking to this guy and talking to this guy and getting Congress on board and getting the foreign policy community on board. I mean, it's a lot of work. If you think about sort of like, for example, the American Jimmy Carter's successful effort around the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, 40 years ago. Carter did a lot of work on that. If you think about like the six-party talks where George Bush sort of worked with other countries to try to get North Korea to denuclearize. This was like 20 years ago. It didn't work. But it was a lot of effort. The Americans put like 20, 30 months into this effort to really try to make it work, and it still didn't. And Trump just seems to think that like he can go on TV and like say stuff on Twitter and, other countries are going to do what he said, and that just, elites just, foreign countries just don't act like that. Other countries have agency, and Trump doesn't seem to get. I'm kind of surprised, actually, that Trump still seems to respond this way, but he's just got to do more work. And I'll be honest, just personally, I think that's difficult for Trump. I think the guy's kind of lazy. I think he doesn't like reading. He's got to read a lot. And
I was about to ask you on that. You tweeted yesterday or the other day that you thought that Donald Trump was lazy and in an incompetent position, I guess, when it comes to global conflict. So can you elaborate on why you think the president is too lazy and incompetent on these big issues?
Because for the reasons I was trying to suggest before, which is that, I mean, diplomatic deals that persist and hang on require a lot of effort. Again, if you look at the Camp David Accords back in the 70s that Jimmy Carter shepherded through, that was a lot of work getting the Israelis and the Egyptians and Congress all on board. It was a lot of time and effort. There was a lot of staff work. There was an interagency process that worked through all the bureaucratic difficulties on the American side, and then involved reaching out to these other two parties that were at war and bringing them on board and trying to make sure there were no third-party spoilers on the outside, like the Syrians or the Soviets or something like that. That's a lot of work, right? Same thing if you look at the six-party talks, right, where George W. Bush really worked on North Korean denuclearization. It didn't work, but the Bush people put a lot of effort into that. I mean, I know a couple people who are on that, and it was a lot of time and a lot of effort. They're running all over the place. They're talking to North Koreans in New York at the UN, and they're talking to the Russians and trying to keep the Chinese on board. You're juggling all these balls up in the air at the same time, and it was a lot of effort, right? And Trump is he's just not good at effort. He loves tweeting on his phone. He's golfing all the time. I mean, Trump, we know that Trump doesn't read the presidential daily brief. We know that Trump doesn't read a great deal, and I think that's what's coming through here, right? And for what it's worth, we saw this back in 2017 or in 18-19 when Trump tried to negotiate with North Korea on nuclear weapons. It failed for the same reason. We have a lot of sort of like post-Trump writing by people around him that said he didn't read his briefing books, he didn't prepare, he just got off the plane and walked in and thought that Kim Jong-un would give up the nukes because Trump was phenomenal or something like that. And that's,
I think that what we know about the way that Trump operates is that he clearly, from what we know from just recounts of his time in the office, is that he does a lot more hours than perhaps the average president. He's up earlier, he's up later, but I agree. I think his method to the madness is so different from a traditional leader, because he isn't a traditional leader. He's a businessman, and he clearly approaches everything as if it's a business deal. So it's a different approach, and these global conflicts, they clearly take a lot of time. So I mean, we made fun of Trump for this 2-week notice that he kept pointing out, and then we almost praised him for not even waiting for the 2-week deadline when he bombed Iran. But I think it's just more that you can't really predict what happens next. You can't predict the can of the worms or the Pandora's box that opens up when you bomb another country. But I want to get into an interesting tweet that a comment that Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social. He said that China can now continue to purchase Iranian oil now that one of the main shipping lanes is no longer under threat because, of course, the conflict between Israel and Iran. But he also said that hopefully China then buys plenty of oil from the US, as just a side note. So I wonder, with everything happening in Iran and everything happening with Russia, Should Trump be trying to broker some sort of economic deal with China when it comes to them buying US oil, instead of China funneling so much money into Russia and Iran, where they get a lot of their oil, two countries of which clearly enjoy war and clearly enjoy supporting monetarily terrorists, being Iran and Russia? But is that too risky, do you think, Bob, to be creating these economic deals with China?
Yeah, it's not really clear to me quite what Trump had in mind. In fact, if you look at the way the financial markets and websites and so on have responded to this, they've kind of been, it's like been bafflement. It's like, what exactly was Trump trying to do? I think there are a couple things that are going on here. I think, first of all, Trump is trying to reach out to China. I think Trump is genuinely concerned that the big issue for the United States in the future is China. Certainly the people around him, like Rubio and Elbridge Colby and Tim Walz, who's since been removed. He's surrounded by a lot of China hawks who are telling him that a conflict with China is coming down the pipe, and I think he's kind of nervous about that. I think Trump's kind of gun shy in the use of American force, and so this is sort of reaching out to China. I think the other thing is that Trump wants to sort of create the impression that there's like a peace deal with Iran and that things are cool, right? Things are okay, and so if China can import from Iran to suggest normalization, right? But what everybody else has pointed out, and I think what you're kind of driving at too, right, of course, is that we sanction Iran and we tell other countries you shouldn't buy oil from them. I don't think the Chinese care about that. They're not going to listen to us, right? But we do sort of sanction Iran, and we try to tell other countries, smaller ones, weaker ones than China, don't buy from Iran because we've been trying to isolate Iran. So it's a little strange. You know, and again, I mean, this is Trump, right? I mean, he just kind of shoots stuff out on the phone. I mean, this is what I mean about the incompetence thing, right? I mean, ideas kind of tumble through the president's head, and he like punches them out on his phone without thinking about it, right? You know, I don't know. You know, he said regime change in Iran 2 days ago.
I know, but it was an interesting thing to tweet. You should buy US oil when you've also failed to kind of support this sanctions bill that's been a bipartisan sanctions bill on Russian oil that has been proposed by both Lindsey Graham and a Democratic senator and is backed by 82 senators. And yet Donald Trump has kind of not supported it, but really stalled it to the point where they haven't even taken it to the Senate floor because the Republicans in the Senate are clearly a bit worried about how that would go down with Donald Trump. But it's just interesting that he knows that oil is the area in which could really shape, make or break an economy. So I don't know, just one to think about, that perhaps getting in bed with China might be a way to cripple not only Russia but Iran's economy. But I want to get into the NATO summit that's kicked off today. Of course, leaders arrived last night. They had their photo, but the NATO Secretary General, he's praised Donald Trump's involvement in brokering this ceasefire and using military action in Iran. He said that the world is safer because of it. So I wonder, do you think he's cushioning up to Trump to make sure that he remains committed to NATO at this summit? Because there's so much speculation that Trump, and he's made various comments about NATO and the alliance and whether the US needs to get out of it.
Yes, I think that's correct. The previous Secretary General of NATO, Secretary General, he spoke the same way, right, about Trump. He sort of engaged in this kind of like excessive flattery and stuff like that, and that was kind of designed to help keep Trump sort of on board. And he helped. He repeatedly credited Donald Trump with getting U.S. allies in NATO to spend more on defense. I think that was more sort of through carrot or through stick than carrot, but it does seem to have worked. But yeah, I think there's a lot of concern out there in NATO that Trump would not, in fact, maintain the Article 5 commitment, that Trump would not, in fact, fight for a NATO state, particularly if that NATO state fought Russia, which is the most likely outcome. Trump's got this weird relationship with Putin we've all known about for a decade. Yeah, I think that's big. In fact, I would say myself, I would be, if I were a European state, I would not believe that Donald Trump would, in fact, meet that commitment, right? And I think that's going to lead the Europeans to spend a great deal more on defense. That's why the Europeans are increasingly doing the Ukraine thing on their own, right? They're just kind of like delinking from the United States on Ukraine support because they just don't think Trump believes in it, which I think it's pretty clear he doesn't.
Well, what's the likelihood, do you think, that we will walk away from NATO and, from the NATO summit, and each country would have committed to 5% defense spending?
5% is really, really high. 5% is like Cold War level spending, right? I think that makes sense for Asian states that are near China, right? If you're Japan, South Korea, or India, I think maybe 5% might make sense because you're right next door to the world's biggest autocracy. But in Europe, that's going to be a harder sell. The United States doesn't spend 5%, right? And the United States is around like 4%. And if you divide U.S. spending between Asia and Europe, it's actually around 2% for both theaters. So we're actually telling our local theater allies to spend double what we're spending. Will they do it? Probably not. It would take a pretty big, heavy lift. You're going to have leftist and social democratic parties in all these countries are going to say, no way. The bite out of social welfare spending would be too great. It looks like we're engaging in arms race with the Russians or the Chinese, right? I think NATO might support it, that kind of language, because it's kind of costless to support it. It'll keep Trump happy. They probably don't think their own domestic. They probably don't think most of the members will go for it. I would be surprised if anybody got to 5%, including the Americans, in 10 years, unless the Russians had, I don't know, launched a nuclear weapon or something like that. But 5% is highly unlikely. That's very, very high.
Bob, just a final question. Trump, he is there. He's at the NATO summit, but he will be having kind of a sideline chat with President Zelensky on this trip. Are you hopeful that it will be a positive discussion, or are you more pessimistic that he has completely dipped out of helping Ukraine?
Hopeful insofar as that I think it's pretty clear now. Well, I don't know if Trump gets it, but I think the rest of us have realized that Putin just doesn't want a peace deal that's remotely fair or equitable or anything like that, right? I mean, Putin got offered a lot, right? Renormalization, removal of sanctions, right? The new border would effectively be the line of contact, which is to say that Putin could keep what he had conquered, including Ukraine, including Crimea. I mean, the Ukrainians, we twisted their arm, Trump twisted their arm, and the Ukrainians gave, right? But Putin wanted way more, right? Putin wanted stuff he hasn't already conquered, right? Which the Ukrainians, I mean, they're not gonna do that, right? I mean, the Russians just didn't bend, right? And so I think Zelensky's argument when he meets Trump is better than it was before. It's like, look, we made these concessions, we were willing to deal, and the Russians are just implacable. Putin is just implacable. So yeah, I have the feeling it's going to work out better, right? Also because Trump will be around a lot of other NATO leaders who support Zelensky, right? If Zelensky and Trump meet one-on-one in Washington, it'll be like it was last time. But in the NATO context, I would be surprised if Trump picked a fight.
Oh, and just hoping that these NATO leaders, I guess, put the pressure on Donald Trump to continue supporting Ukraine, and that pressure doesn't backfire with Donald Trump being told what to do. But Professor Robert Kelly, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.